Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between Michael K. Vaughan and myself, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we have wasted our youths. And this started out as a feature on Mike's channel, where he was just talking about his epic collections. Not his epic collection, but his epic collection. Marvel does a full-color paperback reprint run called the Epic Collection line. It's really, really good. The books are a little bit pricey. They were in the neighborhood of $40 a volume, and that's going up this year to much closer to the neighborhood of $50 a year, which is starting to put them close to Marvel Masterworks territory, even though they're not hardcovers. But you get a lot in those volumes. I have never had an epic collection where I didn't feel like I got a lot for my money. There are quite a few coming out this year that I want. Quite a few, probably 6 or 7. They won't be the same ones that Michael K. Vaughan gets because, as Michael K. Vaughan, as I've pointed out, when his comic book tastes do not precisely coincide with my own, they're terrible. And you would think that wouldn't be a problem, surely, if the two of you are doing a weekly feature about comic books, then 50% of the time you'll be able to determine what goes on. But no, like I said, it was a feature on his channel, and I horned my way in. And the devil's bargain that I struck, written in my own blood, was that therefore he would pick what we talk about. Now, I'm only joking when I say that he is wrong about everything all the time. I think in the main, probably 70% of our comic book taste is largely the same. I would like to think that is true for most superhero comic book readers. I think that most superhero comic book readers, no matter where their taste might lie, will look back and say, well, that was a great run, that is a great series, etc., etc. I don't know how much doubt there would be when it comes to that. In other words, I'm not sure how many Herb Trimpe fans there are. But nevertheless, the rest of the time, Michael K. Vaughan is free to pick things that that are tough to talk about. I have had to take the wheat with the chaff during Epic Comic Book Wednesdays because I love it so much. I love finding a diehard comic book fan. That's so much fun. Another diehard comic book fan who is not nuts. Michael K. Vaughan, despite what you might think from watching his channel or from seeing how many hundreds and thousands of hardcover commemorative editions of comics he has of trash, is not nuts. He is not nuts. I think BookTube might be driving him nuts, but that's true for all of us. But nevertheless, since he's doing the picking, I am wide open during August, because August is the month of garbage. It is the month of Garb August. This is a trash-oriented BookTube event, the trash-oriented BookTube event, created last year by Ollie at Criminale. Michael K. Vaughan and I have been co-hosts. We hope to be co-hosts until we're rotting in the trash bin. And Mike has decided that in August we're going to read trash comics. Cue Prez. This was a comic book. It had just a few issues from DC Comics in 1973 and 1974, in which, in 1971, the 26th Amendment passed, which lowered the voting age. It allowed 18-year-olds to vote in America. Under the very vocal and very common sense rationale that if you can send these people off to die, they ought to be able to vote. If they're good enough, if they're adult enough to carry a machine gun into the jungles of Vietnam, then they ought to be old enough to vote when they're at home. But that's not the real impetus of this story at all, I think. We'll never know, fortunately, because I think pretty much everyone connected with this book is not only dead, but roasting in hell where they belong. This was created by Joe Simon, who really ought to have known better. Joe Simon is not the name you will know, but he created a character that you will know. He created Captain America. It's often said in comic book lore, it is absolutely cemented now in comic book lore, that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America. I've been down this route before on Epic Comic Book Wednesday. I don't mean to beat a dead Kirby. Kirby drew Captain America. Now, if you want to say that when it comes to a comic book character, that is partial creation, okay, fine. Kirby drew Captain America from the beginning. He designed Captain America. So if you want to say that that means that he co-created Captain America, fine. If we're talking about ideas on paper, if we're talking about coming up with the idea, Jack Kirby had no more to do with this than Joe Simon's dog did. But Joe Simon went on to create this. A short-lived, thank God, comic book series in which a teenager named Prez becomes president of the United States. And has as sort of his, I want to say Man Friday, but that is a very racist, outdated phrase. But then again, this character is treated extremely racistly. I don't know if you can see there, but there is a very stereotypical shirtless American Indian with a feather sticking up out of his headband right there. That is a character named Eagle Free, who Prez makes the leader of, I think, the CIA or the FBI or something like that. There's enormous amounts of power. The two of them are best buddies, but the series is never even vaguely interesting enough to make them lovers. Instead, they're just best buddies, and for some reason, everybody else is dressed normally, but Eagle Free is dressed like a 17th century Arapaho warrior. No shirt, moccasins, weird Buffalo Bill style fringed pants, the kind of thing that the First Nations people would have worn in Buffalo Bill's traveling sideshow. And you might think, well, okay, so that kind of just blatant tokenism is a result of Joe Simon's barely repressed racism. But no. Prez derived from one particular set of social circumstances. I know that historians of this book, I read an article in the late lamented Comics Journal that went on and on, palavered about this thing forever and ever, and said that the 26th Amendment was the ultimate origin for this thing. I'm sure that comic book databases now just parrot that article if it's online. I'm sure that they do. I'm sure they don't think one way or another. But no, no. Joe Simon didn't have any idea what the 26th Amendment was. Nobody reading comics knew either. Nobody knew anything about that. One thing they did know about, however, that would lead you to want to create a story in which an idealistic Nazi youth, blue-eyed, long, blonde-haired teenager becomes president because he's not corrupt would be Watergate. Watergate is, of course, the origin of this wretched handful of issues. This wretched handful of issues obviously comes from Watergate. This comes from the fact that a scandal broke in the Oval Office that totally destroyed the country's faith in the presidency. And this was sort of, a breath of fresh air. Let's have a youth, a local youth. Let's have a youth come in here and do it right. This was also the dawn of the youth movement, when you had hippies on every corner, left, right, and center. Good Lord. It was never any easier than it was here for me or Deb to get lucky, but we didn't want to. I mean, honestly, one breath would knock these things over. But Prez has adventures in these issues. And those adventures are partially, I believe, spawned by Watergate, but not Eagle Free. Eagle Free has another origin story, so to speak. He gets an origin story, I think, in one of these issues. But his real origin story is something called the Crying Indian. Some of you will remember, some of you will be old enough to remember that. It's possible that Michael K. Vaughan might be old enough so that in his childhood he remembers TV commercials about pollution, about litter, that featured a stereotypical, Calvin Coolidge style storeroom Indian in full regalia, turning slowly towards the camera, and there's one stoic tear running down his cheek. Because, of course, he is the embodiment of the natural world, and he is seeing it all clogged with litter. That Crying Indian commercial did the 1970s equivalent of go viral. It was everywhere. It was mocked. It was parodied. Every single editorial cartoonist in the entire country had a whack at it. There were all sorts of editorials written about it, some of which, to give them credit, in the early 70s, went on and on about how insulting it was, about how demeaning and stereotypical it was. And that's, I believe, where Eagle Free comes from, there instead of anywhere else, which heaps irony upon irony, because, of course, Joe Simon didn't know anything about First Nation people whatsoever. And also, And also, the actor who played the crying Indian was Italian. And not a drop of First Nation blood in him. So there's just irony on top of irony on top of irony. The way the 70s were, oh my God, if you didn't experience it, there's no way that I can explain it to you. There's no way that I can explain the 70s. In fact, go to the nearest really old person that you know. Your parents, if they're old enough, grandparents, if they're old enough, somebody at your church or at your school, and ask them in a friendly way, in a non-confrontational way, ask them, can you explain what the 70s were like? Watch what happens to their face. If they're really old and you ask them about the 60s, their face will not undergo that same transformation. If you ask them about the 80s, absolutely not. They'll have plenty of opinions. They'll have plenty of things. Oh yeah, I can tell you a lot about the 80s. Sit down, I'll tell you plenty of stories. The 90s, oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. I believe the 90s are when Michael K. Vaughan was a child. I think. But if you go to that same person who's old enough maybe to tell you stories about the 60s, and you say, so what can you tell me about the 70s? Watch the look on their face. There is no explanation for the decade of the 70s. None whatsoever. But this, I think, came from there. It's not a good idea. It's a terrible idea. The 18-year-old human brain, especially the 18-year-old male brain, has not finished forming. You are still in the grip of uncontrollable hormonal impulses that will affect your judgment. They'll even affect your distance gauging. It's a wonder that we give 18-year-olds licenses to drive vehicles. They're not fully formed human beings. They're quite literally not fully formed human beings. The idea that you would elect one as president, of course, is nonsense. And that raises the one little interesting question about this series. The one question, I didn't have an answer to it when I was looking at these things in the 70s. I don't have an answer to it now. And I don't think I've ever read any interview that would give me that answer. Not that I would believe it. The one sliver of interest here, it is just a sliver of interest. This is garbage. If this is how Michael K. Vaughan is starting things off for Garb August, I shudder to think what he will do in the course of the month. I shudder to think, will this finally be the month where he makes me talk about ROM, Space Night? I don't know. I don't know. I have a feeling, though, that partly these picks are going to be done to torture me. Because there are plenty of things that DC and Marvel did around the same time that look like trash and aren't. A lot of their toy buy-in things look like trash on the surface and are not. If you knew that DC Comics did, for instance, a comic book adaptation of Atari Force, you would assume it was garbage. It wasn't. If you knew that Marvel Comics did a tie-in for Micronauts, you would assume it was garbage, and it was not. Michael Golden artwork, for God's sake. But this, but the only interesting thing here, the one whisper of interest, I don't know where it comes from, and I don't know how much weight to put on it, is that I think the 2 or 3 or 4 issues of Prez that came out might have been satire. On some level below the youth movement. I'm sure that Joe Simon's editors at DC said, this is a big deal, you know, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the long hair, the kids, the hippies, Woodstock, all that sort of stuff. Get on that. Give us a hero who's like that. No radiation, no superpowers, no nothing like that. Just give him a normal, long-haired, beatnik kid in its turtleneck. And Joe Simon, you know, good shoulder that he is, probably said yes. It's possible. I don't think so, because he barely had 2 brain cells to rub together himself. It's possible that he worked in an element of satire to Prez that was designed to fly below the radar of his watching editors. Joe Simon was from the World War II school of comic books. He absolutely did not care what the reader thought. He only cared about his editors. That's all. Well, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that he wouldn't have cared whether or not the reader got it. But he would have cared if he put that in there, that the editors didn't catch that he was mocking the idea he was being paid to put forward. Because Prez is a terrible president. And he's presiding over a hellscape of a nation. Despite, you know, a cover like this, the America where Prez is president is not a place you would want to live. It's full of violence and explosions and civil unrest and whatnot. It's not idyllic. It's not like, on one level, yes, on one level this comic's saying, you know, we just elect a kid. They've got their whole future in front of them. This cover even says, you can't really make it out, it says you've had your chance. The banner says you've had your chance. Now it's our turn. It's a turn of youth. The United States is about to go through a real life version of this because Gen Z is about to mature into voting age in battalions, in absolute battalions. What was a trickle in the last, for instance, national presidential election is going to be an absolute tsunami in 2024. And these young people, these 18-year-olds, have been online their whole life. And yes, there are all sorts of information silos, but they know what's happening. They're looking around the world and seeing these 90-year-olds in Congress are having brain short circuits. They're being propped up in congressional meetings and told what to say on camera while our planet goes to hell. While we're having 125-degree days, day after day after day after day after day, where these 90-year-olds are trying their hardest to make it illegal for us to vote. They're making it illegal for half of us to seek health care. They're not blind to that. That voting bloc of today's youth, today's hippies, they're not blind. And they might be liberal or conservative, they might be all over the political spectrum, but they're not suicidal. They're not going to allow, well, we'll see. We'll see. But that was the attitude here that Joe Simon was supposed to celebrate with Prez. That, you know, we've got a kid in charge and he knows what he's hep. He's hep to the jive that's going on today. It's possible, though, that Joe Simon, crusty old World War II vet that he was subtly mocking that idea the whole time that he was doing it, because Prez is not doing well as a president. You're never told that. I don't think you are. He has enemies. He fights monsters. He fights bad guys. He fist fights, etc., etc. Needless to say, nothing of the dramatic potential of a teenager becoming president is even remotely looked at, much less explored in these books. That's why they're so bad. That's why they're garbage, because they're just so frustrating. But while he's doing all of that, he is definitely failing as president. The country is a hellhole. And that could be Joe Simon being more interesting than the comic that he was writing. I doubt it. It's probably just a dumb. Instead of having insightful social commentary in mind, he probably had something dumb in mind. Like, you know, kids these days, they wouldn't even notice if America was going to hell in a handbasket, or they're the problem, not the solution, or whatever. Either way, just in these 20 minutes, I have given this wretched excress of a comic far more serious attention than it deserves. This is how we're kicking off Garb August for Epic Comic Book Wednesday, with a comic so bad that when DC Comics inevitably, they made a reprint volume of this. Can they make big fat paperback reprint volumes in full color of Golden Age Superman? No, they cannot. Can they do a big fat 800-page full color reprint with all sorts of editorial extras for Superboy or Robin the Boy Wonder? No, they can't be bothered to do that. But they made a collected volume of this, of Prez, including the legendary unpublished final issue. I kept hoping that he would go to Dealey Plaza. But, they made a volume of this, a collected volume of this garbage, and it is so bad that I, A, guarantee you that Michael K. Vaughan has that volume, and B, guarantee you no one else does. So this is how we're starting off, with Prez, America's first teenage president. And the worst part of it is that Epic Comic Book Wednesday for Garb August is only going downhill from here. Oh my God. I will see you next week. Thank you, BookTube.